Okay, thank you everybody for coming to our program tonight. We're excited to have Douglas Wolk. He is the author of the Eisner Award-winning reading comics and the host of the podcast Voice of Latveria. A National Arts Journalism Program Fellow, Wolk has written about comic books, graphic novels, pop music, and technology for the New York Times, Rolling Stone, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Believer, Slate, and Pitchfork. And we'll get to his presentation.
Hi, thank you so much, Jeff. I am delighted to see everybody in Zoomland. So what I'm talking about tonight is my book, All of the Marvels, which came out a few months ago from Penguin, which is a book about what happened when I read all 27,000 Marvel superhero comics published since 1961, because I wanted to see what that gigantic 60-year-long, 500,000 page long story looked like as a story. What it said about the world that produced it and that it was born into. And it really is all one big story. Like, any part of it can refer to any previous part. Characters from one thread of it can turn up another. It's all expected to hang together, whether or not it actually does hang together. There's some problematic bits, but it really is kind of one gigantic story. So I've got like a little lecture and slideshow, which is not actually a thing that's in the book, but we'll get to that. But before that, in the spirit of extreme silliness, I have brought my invisible ukulele here. All of the Marvels has a theme song, so I'm going to sing the theme song before I get started, and then I'll give the talk, and then we'll have questions and answers, and I am happy to answer any questions you've got about this stuff. This is actually based. I was toting my short box up the stairway to my storage space when the ghost of Stanley appeared and got right up in my face. He said, "Howdy, true believer." I said, "Smiley, get thee gone. If you presented it, I've read it. You've got nothing left to sell me on." He said, "Of course I do, Effendi. Let me have a look." I said, "Nope, I've read through every Marvel superhero book. I read every one, Stan. I read every one, Stan. It was mostly fun, Stan. Shared them with my son, Stan. Comics by the ton, Stan. I read every one. I read Gamma Core, Force, Omega Flight, Valkyrie, Vision, Vote, Lucky Venom, Space Knight, Nick Fury, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Jubilee, Spider-Man, Reptilian Rage, Monsters on the Prowl, and Creatures on the Loose, The Amazing Spider-Man, Fight Substance Abuse, and I read every one, Stan. I read every one, Stan. It was mostly fun, Stan. Shared them with my son, Stan. Comics by the ton, Stan. I read every one. I read Strange Tales, Marvel Tales, Tales of Suspense, Punisher and Wolverine, Damaging Evidence, Tomb of Darkness, Crypt of Shadows, Chamber of Chills, White Tiger, Windmaker, Winter Soldier, Winter Kills, Codename Spitfire, Firestar Blaze, Annihilation, Damnation, and Last Days. I read every one, Stan. I read every one, Stan. It was mostly fun, Stan. Share them with my son, Stan. Comics by the ton, Stan. I read every one. I read U.S. Agent Captain Britain, X-Men Captain Universe, Doctor Spectrum, Doctor Strange, Linda Carter, Student Nurse, Blood Seed, Bloodstone, Blood and Glory, Blink, Blade, Inferno, Inhumanity, Infinity Crusade, Hercules, Prince of Power, Caswar, Chaos King, Wonder Man, Giant Size Man Thing. I read every one, Stan. I read every one, Stan. It was mostly fun, Stan. Share them with my son, Stan. Comics by the ton, Stan. I read every one. I read Dominic Fortune, Domino, Hot Shots, Mighty Thor, Mystic Mosaic, Magic, Micronauts, Rom Rogue, Royals, Ruins, Rocket Raccoon, Marvel Now, Point One, Deadpool 2, Soon, Thor Core, Marvel's Captain Marvel and the Carol Core, 15 Love, Fantastic Four, 1, 2, 3, 4. I read every one, Stan. I read every one, Stan. It was mostly fun, Stan. Shared them with my son, Stan. Comics by the ton, Stan. I read every one. I read each and every one. I read every one. Theme song for you. No, I'm not going to quit my day job. Thank you. So I do, as I said, have an audio-visual presentation for y'all. And Jeff, successfully sharing? We are successfully screen sharing. Hooray. So I hope you can all see it. Pipe up if you can't see it. So this is a talk called A History of the Marvel Universe in 5 Objects, because the Marvel story is a story that has been going on for a bit over 60 years now. In some sense, it started in the summer of 1961. And there are certain objects that appear in some form again and again that tell us something about what kind of story it is. And the first of them is the time platform here. The time platform is an actual working time machine. It was invented in college by Victor Von Doom, the demi-hero, demi-villain, also known as Dr. Doom. I do a weekly, but currently on pause, podcast about him called The Voice of Latveria. But the characteristics of the time platform are, first of all, it's not just a time machine, it is a space and time machine. Because if you're traveling through time, it has something called a chronoton protection field, which hasn't always been used by people who don't know how to use it. Basically, it is an anti-butterfly effect thing built into it. So you can't, change the present by going back and changing the past by using Dr. Doom's time machine. It gives off this stuff called Von Doom radiation, which is very noisy, very dirty. You see what him kind of like rises up over you and changes at the time you're in. Now, the first chronological appearance of the time machine, of Dr. Doom's time platform on Earth, was around 100 million years ago during the Cretaceous period, when Godzilla fought devil dinosaurs in the 70s. This period is actually identified as 900 million years ago here. Maybe that's when the Marvel Universe's Cretaceous period was. Anyway, but it was used to transport Godzilla here into the past. It turned up again in the year 2940 BC in an early issue of Fantastic Four in the palace of Ramatut. Ramatut was a time traveler from the far future who was also an Egyptian pharaoh, and his time machine was the Sphinx. Because it was 1963, 1964, and Cleopatra was going to be in theaters, and so everything was very Egyptian thing. So the Fantastic Four showed up in his courtroom, and then much later, Doctor Strange was astrally traveling backwards through time, and somehow ended up in the same time and the same place as the rest of them. And then the West Coast Avengers were traveling through time a few years later, and they also ended up in the same time and the same place, although kind of in a different room, so nobody could notice that the other ones were there. And the Apocalypse, who is this guy who's been involved around that time in the same building in the Sphinx time machine, although he was behind a wall at the time, so you could see him the first time around. Apocalypse, keep an eye on him. We're going to be seeing him again. Now, since Dr. Doom can travel through time and Ramatut can travel through time, the question naturally arose early on: are they the same person? Could they be the same man living in 2 different ages? And this question was eventually comprehensively answered: no, different guys. Dr. Doom's time platform was also taken by the Thing from the Fantastic Four to the year 130 BC, so that his friend Alicia Masters could meet Alexandros of Antioch. But unfortunately, the Thing got into a fight with Hercules and accidentally broke the arms off the Venus de Milo. So that's how that happened. It was also used to go to the Arthurian era by Dr. Doom and Iron Man. And it was also, that was a period like Dr. Doom had a girlfriend back then. He would like travel through time to go see his girlfriend. We'll be seeing more of his girlfriend. Dr. Doom's time platform was taken by the Avengers to the year 1348 because they wanted to see the Black Death for themselves for some reason. And it was hijacked by Cotton Mather. Yes, that Cotton Mather. Hijacked by Cotton Mather to take the Scarlet Witch to the year 1692, for the Salem witch trials. And of course, in its first published appearance, as opposed to its first chronologically in the world of this fictional world appearance, its first published appearance, it was used by Dr. Doom to send the Fantastic Four to the 18th century to retrieve some jewels that may or may not have been Infinity Gems, during the course of which the Thing investigated the legend of Blackbeard and discovered that he himself was Blackbeard, because causality. It was also used in the year 2099 for Doom to go meet his future self, kind of, and it was used to take the Thing and Captain America to the early 3000s to meet the original Guardians of the Galaxy, who were the ones who were around in the 30th century and inspired the 20th or 21st century Guardians of the Galaxy, because causality in comic books, they have a special relationship. Now, what does the time platform mean in the context of the big Marvel story? It means the time is fluid for the purposes of the story, and I talk about a little this in all of Marvel's, about the way that Marvel has 3 or 4 different chronologies. There's the one in which the story was published, there's the one in which the events of the story happen, and in a different way, the one in which each character experiences those events, which can be different because time travel. But the most important chronology is the one in which you experience it as a reader. For the purposes of reading, you have a time machine. You don't have to read everything in order. You can read things in any order you like. You can start some recent point and then jump to the far past and then jump to something in the 90s and then jump to something in the 70s and then jump to something recent again. You have a time machine. Why not use it? I hear people saying like, oh, but I have to start at the beginning. I have to read. No, you don't. Not only do you not want to do that, you basically can't do that, because there's always more of the story that can be added now and go back and change something that happened earlier. But you have a time machine. Jump wherever you like. So our second of these 5 special artifacts that turn up all over the Marvel story is the Darkhold, which is a peculiarly mutable object. It turned up just a month or 2 ago in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, if anybody saw that. The Darkhold is this book. It is a collection of spells that was written down by the elder god Cthon, or Chthon, if you prefer. He is the god of chaos, and his magic makes things more chaotic, or chaotic, I guess. It's called the Darkhold because it was written in a cave inside Wundagore Mountain, known as the Darkhold, D-A-R-Q-U-E. Okay, it's described here as being the first book, which is overstating things. Initially, the Darkhold was just some scrolls, and in fact, decoratively leather-bound books were not invented until around the year 400 AD. But the Darkhold can make vampires, werewolves, zombies, and other things that the Comics Code used to prohibit from the 50s to the 70s, or later in the case of zombies. That's a whole other thing. But so a notable thing about the Darkhold is that its pages are indestructible. They can be separated, but they can't be destroyed. And there was an early cult of mystics in Atlantis that tried to use the Darkhold to take over the world, but they also used it to make vampires, which killed them, so that didn't go well for them. The Darkhold also turned up in England in the 6th century, where Modred the Mystic here tried to use it. That didn't go well for him. And Modred is not to be confused with Mordred the Mystic, different person, whose contemporary Morgan Le Fay founded a new cult around it in Arthurian times, which didn't go well either. Incidentally, Morgan Le Fay, that Lord Morgan Le Fay, is the one who was Dr. Doom's girlfriend I was mentioning earlier. So anyway, the Darkhold is kept turning up in unexpected places, like a pre-Babylonian tomb in the 1920s, which is how Carnage got mixed up with it, long story. And it was in the trunk that was opened in the 1950s by Jimmy Woo, who was an agent of an organization called Atlas and later an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. You may have seen them in the Ant-Man movies or on WandaVision. And then it fell into the hands of a guy named Gregory Russoff, who just by reading it activated a curse and became a werewolf. And that curse he passed on to his son, who turned into a werewolf just by touching it. So the Darkhold pretty much corrupts anybody who touches it. So Doctor Strange, at least the version of the comics, figured out that he had to read it from a distance smart, because it also, like, it's not entirely useless stuff. It included a very useful spell called the Montesi formula, which could destroy all vampires, which Doctor Strange did. Go Doctor Strange. And the only one that it spared was a guy named Hannibal King, who had decided when he became a vampire that he would never bite a human, so instead he just robbed blood banks and stuff, because that's okay. Unfortunately, Doctor Strange screwed it up because of some stuff involving his brother, also long story. So a few years later, vampires came back, and now the Montesi formula doesn't work anymore. Oh well. A tear is shed. Later on, this little guy started turning up and offering people individual pages from the Darkhold, which could get them out of whatever jam they were in at the cost of their soul. Very Twin Peaks looking there. And of course, it keeps falling into the hands of poor Wanda Maximoff. Poor thing. Now, what this says is that from the Darkhold comes monsters, but that's not quite true. What comes from the Darkhold is transformations. And the Marvel story is full of people who have been transformed one way or another against their will, or who find themselves with powers that they never asked for. They could be heroes, villains, mutants. The change comes to you. And the question that the Marvel story keeps asking is, what are you going to do about it? And sometimes you don't get a choice about that, and that's what the Darkhold does. Now, a third of these 5 unusual and special objects that keep turning up within the Marvel story is the Shield of Imhotep, which you see here. Now, this may be kind of familiar looking because it's the ancestor of a few other shields. Now, in our world, Imhotep was a chancellor to the pharaoh Djoser in the 27th century BC. In the Marvel world, he was the pharaoh himself, lots of extra pharaohs in the Marvel world. And it was in the 27th century, during the reign of Pharaoh Imhotep, that the Earth was invaded by the Brood, who were these, ugly, icky kind of insectoid monsters who fought the X-Men a bunch of times. So Earth was invaded by the Brood. Imhotep beat them back, and he either formed a group called the Brotherhood of the Shield, or had that group name themselves in his honor. Accounts differ. Now, he didn't do it alone. He did it as part of an alliance with Moon Knight, you may have seen on TV, who was the earthly avatar of the Egyptian god Khonshu, and Apocalypse, who we met already a little while ago, hanging out behind the walls of the Sphinx that was also the Time Machine. But the organization has persisted in some form ever since. It is now better known simply as S.H.I.E.L.D. It has had some famous members, too. Leonardo da Vinci, who you see here, was an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and so were Sir Isaac Newton and Michelangelo and Galileo, and so in fact was Benjamin Franklin, who is wearing his S.H.I.E.L.D. pin here. Ben Franklin actually had lots of contact with present-day superheroes. Like, there was the time that he hooked up with Doctor Strange's girlfriend Clea, who was time traveling, and much later, Ben Franklin's ghost moved into Deadpool's house for a while. But also, when he met Captain America, who was time traveling at the time too, Ben Franklin was so impressed by his costume and shield that he suggested it to Betsy Ross as a design reference for the American flag she was working on designing at the time, which is how you ended up with this amazing scene by Jack Kirby, God bless him, from 1976, where Captain America runs into the street shouting, "It isn't possible, it just isn't possible, I've been ripped off by Benjamin Franklin." Love it. Now, Captain America is famously associated with S.H.I.E.L.D., the organization, and also famously has a shield, whose best-known iteration was given to him by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you see here. It was made by a metallurgist named Dr. Myron McLean, who was trying to recreate the metal adamantine, not adamantium, but adamantine, which is what the Golden Maze of Hercules was made of, you see here. And an alloy that Dr. McLean created, which is now known as proto-adamantium, mysteriously combined with a sample of Wakandan vibranium, and somehow Dr. McLean got the idea to cast it in the form of a perfectly round shield. Was Dr. Myron McLean a sleeper agent of the Brotherhood of the Shield? No one's talking. You heard it here. But and what the Shield of Imhotep and all of its shieldy offspring tell us in the context of the Marvel story is that there is a force that protects us from and defends us against monstrosities and catastrophes, and that force is science and knowledge. all the most interesting heroes and villains of the first decade of Marvel have PhDs. A lot of the more recently introduced superheroes are geniuses or one kind or another, science geniuses. Science and knowledge keep showing up as the force that propels the story onward. So here's our fourth item, the ultimate nullifier. The ultimate nullifier first shows up in the story from 1966, the climax of the original Galactus story, where this enormous godlike entity has come to eat the Earth, basically. And the Watcher basically gives it to the Fantastic Four, and this godlike being Galactus recoils in horror, saying, this could destroy everything. What are you thinking? The hands of a human, although his daughter Galacta later points out that Galactus very kindly didn't point out that the safety was still on. So after that first appearance, the Ultimate Nullifier doesn't show up for another 16 years. Until this, which is a what-if story from 1982, where this kind of boring villain named Korvac gets a hold of it, and in his passion to bring order to the universe, quotes, uses the Ultimate Nullifier, and all becomes nothing. This negative space here belongs to Eternity, capital E, who is, within the Marvel story, the reification of the entire universe, if one can say that there can be a reification of the entire universe. And about a decade later, the Ultimate Nullifier turns up again in another story by the same writer, Mark Grunwald. Quasar here tries to use it to nullify the Magus, but ends up accidentally nullifying himself. Because, if you're using the Ultimate Nullifier, you're probably going to nullify yourself too. Reed Richards from the Fantastic Four later on uses it to nullify Abraxas here and effectively destroys the universe and then rebuilds it from scratch. This is a thing that has happened repeatedly in the Marvel story. The universe has been completely destroyed or erased and then rebuilt exactly the way it was. It's happened a number of times. At one point, I believe it actually happened twice in less than a year in Doctor Strange stories. So we're on like the eighth or so iteration of the universe right now. So also around the same time, the Ultimate Nullifier was briefly stolen by the Justice League of America. Long story. But then a funny thing happened. People started taking the Ultimate Nullifier kind of lightly. Spider-Man actually sets it off in this story and explains, well, it's not the Ultimate Annihilator, just kind of changes probability. And then it starts to turn up everywhere. Sometimes it's in alternate universe kind of stories, like here, like a thing that a future version of Star-Lord is trying to get his hands on. And then to think that Space Punisher, yes, Space Punisher is a thing that Space Punisher uses to try to get revenge on the Watchers, and then finds out that it's a hoax, quote, one of our many tools to confuse and control. And there's a different version of the Punisher who becomes bonded with the Ultimate Nullifier on a crashing S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier. And back in the Marvel Universe's main timeline, Spider-Man runs into it again and just like a bunch of stuff that the Thieves Guild stole that they're throwing at him. And then it turns up in a briefcase in Florida with little GB Nick Fury here. And for some reason, Dupe from X-Force has one sitting on his desk along with a six-pack that's got Devil Dinosaur in its packaging. I mean, by this point, you can basically get an Ultimate Nullifier for the price of a slab copy of Wolverine #1. And in fact, my friend Brian, who hosts an amazing podcast called Marvel by the Month, has an Ultimate Nullifier hanging on his wall in case of emergencies. And yes, that is Thor's hammer Mjolnir hanging next to it. It's the thing you can break it with. So what do we know about the Marvel story from the Ultimate Nullifier? Well, when the Ultimate Nullifier first appeared, it was the product of the era of mutual assured destruction, the kind of instant annihilation that we once thought was coming for us at any time. The abrupt end of the Marvel story, or the abrupt end of all stories. But the Marvel comic story isn't a novel. It is no longer even the kind of story that can end. The thing that we once thought could destroy us without our even knowing what hit us, it's still frightening. And it's maybe even more omnipresent and banal than it ever was, but we can joke about it now. So move on to our fifth of our 5 objects through which we're telling a potted history of this story. It's also the most recently introduced one. This is a Krakoan gate. These first appeared about almost exactly 3 years ago in the first issue of House of X, which is one of my favorite comics of the last few years. I will go on about this at enormous length if you give me half a chance. But Krakoan gates here are grown from seeds, and they allow mutants, people who have something kind of funny with their DNA to pass instantly from wherever they are to and from Krakoa, which is the mutant nation on an island in the middle of the ocean. And this came about at the same time as mutants declared self-determination and became a major economic and political force in the world. They went from being, this feared and hated underclass to like, well, we actually, we're kind of running things and we have medications and stuff that everybody wants, and you're just going to have to deal with us. So the first time that the mutant passes through a Krakoan gate, they also learn the Krakoan language because they are establishing their own nation and their own culture and therefore their own language. But only mutants or people accompanied by mutants can go through one. And even then, as it notes here, they have to ask for permission for non-mutants to use a gate. And there's one person for whom things are a little different. This is Kate Pride here, formerly Kitty Pride, who breaks her nose trying to go through it. She's the only one who gets blocked, though. Even if you're not a mutant and you want very, very badly to be a mutant, like the children of the atom here, if you try to pass through a Krakoan gate, you don't go anywhere beyond where you started. You're just on the other side of an arbor. So here's a map of where the gates are all over the world. And they're not just in the world. There's one that goes to Otherworld, which is the magical territory that occupies the same space as the British Isles, but is like magical territory overlaid on it. So you can be in one and not the other, or you can be in both. Comic book physics. Deal with it. There's also a gate that goes to the Summer House, which is where Cyclops from the X-Men and his extended family and his polyamorous cluster all live on the moon, or rather where they did live on the moon until the moon was blown up in Fantastic Four about 5 months ago. That's a whole other thing. There are also quite a few gates in outer space, including this one, which is on Chandalar, which is the throne world of the Shi'ar Empire. The Shi'ar Empire is like the Roman Empire, except it's in space and it's much bigger, and it has people who are kind of like birds. But it's the space bird Roman Empire in space, with space. Plus, of course, there was a Krakoan gate planted very, very early on Mars, which led to the current status of Mars, at least within the Marvel story, we can only hope, which is that mutants terraformed and settled Mars, and also which led to Mars becoming the capital of our solar system under mutant rule. Now, what the Krakoan gates mean in the context of the Marvel story is a couple of things. One of those things is that there are worlds beyond the world that we know, that human existence is only the beginning of the story, and that the Marvel story offers passageways to unimaginable and very imaginable places for those who are willing to be part of it and participate in it. But the gates are also in the story very much political instruments. And another part of their meaning is that in this story, the story in these 27,000 plus comic books is always a political story. It is always somehow about power relations, and it always reflects what those power relations are within our own world. So thank you very much. I am delighted to answer some questions about this presentation, about the book itself, about anything having to do with these comics. Bring it on. Thank you. But first, some water. Jeff, do you want to call on people? Do people want to raise their hands? Do people want to put stuff in the chat? What's good?
Yeah, you could raise your hand if you'd like to speak. You could put it in the chat. Whatever you'd like. Second.
No question too big, no question too small. Teen Librarian Adam says, I have one. Adam,
go ahead. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey, Douglas. I wanted to thank you for that. I signed on. I got the email this morning from Jeff. I read it and I'm like, I got to do this for the teens. But I want to thank you. It was enough that I actually wanted to start reading some myself. So that's pretty cool. The only question, and maybe this is part of your area or not, we have a very popular game in the teen room, Marvel versus Capcom Infinite. If you're familiar with it, how accurate are the characters in the storyline of that to Marvel, or is that not really a question because half of them are from the Capcom universe?
Wow. So my horrible confession is I have never played that game,
Okay.
but I know a lot of comics people who fell in love with that game and fell in love with the characters through that game. Like, do you have faves? Do you have particular characters you like from the game?
Yeah. So I'm a traditionalist, right? I like the ones that are kind of most like the ones everybody loves. So I'm a Captain Marvel, Captain America type guy, I think,
Okay.
you know. So that's what I have there.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, when Captain America throws his mighty shield and all that, like
Yeah.
I think there's a way in which like the games and the comics kind of feed each other.
Mhm.
Like there are certainly comics creators who came up through the games and love to see stuff from them reenacted or paid tribute to in the comics. Uh, Obviously, with the games, you can't get quite as much of the deeper character stuff in.
Right.
Uh, but also, there is a mobile game like Avengers Academy that my son used to play, that had lots and lots of little like deep cut bits of stories and characters. I think he used to play like there was like a Lego Marvel game that was actually like super clever. It was like, okay, yes,
Um,
that's a very deep cut. That's 15 very deep cut characters. That's 85 very deep cut characters you got there. Okay, that's cool.
cool. Like, okay, and I guess the only one that had to come up. What's your answer to the Thanos question? Do we kill half the population for so the rest can be better off?
So, fascinating thing about Thanos in the movies as opposed to the comics, and normally I am completely down with whatever changes the movies want to make. Like you're in this to make it more interesting as a moving visual thing. Take what you like, do what you like with it. But the Thanos of the comics does not want to kill half of the universe to because of resources. Because if you have infinite power, you could also double the resources.
Yeah.
He does it because he is in love with death. He is in love with the reification of death. There is a person who is death, and Thanos adores her and wants to kill half of everything as a show of love for her.
Okay,
She's not impressed.
I actually like that better than the movie one. Okay, thanks, Douglas. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
No, all the Thanos stuff and a lot of the other kind of cosmic stuff from Marvel is mostly derived from the work of one particular guy named Jim Starlin, who he came back from Vietnam and he served in the Navy. He had seen some stuff. He had done some substances. He had seen some visions, and he was going to put it into a story. And so he invented Thanos, he invented Drax, he invented Gamora, he invented all these characters. They showed up in like initially like there was like one issue of Iron Man, a couple of other issues of things. He did a run on Captain Marvel for a while that was really good. And then he took over Warlock, and he did this Warlock serial in the mid 70s. That's still one of my absolute favorite things Marvel has ever published. And so much of the Thanos stuff in the MCU is derived from what he did there and from what he did in the 90s in the comic called the Infinity Gauntlet. Just really interestingly imaginative guy and really worth looking up that stuff from the 70s.
That's awesome. What was his name again?
Jim Starlin, Starlin. He appears in Endgame as one of the people in this kind of counseling group. And that I believe was the MCU like throwing him something like, yeah, you can have a cameo. Like we can't pay you extra for the work that you did decades ago, but we can give you a little role in the movie for which we will pay you quite well. So
awesome.
There's a question from Nick that was sent by direct message who asks, did you see gateways to other worlds or other parts of the world appear throughout the Marvel timeline? Gates different from the Krakoan gates. And Yeah, you see passageways to other worlds and other possible worlds all the time, and also impossible parts of our own world. Like in the Marvel universe, there's Asgard, and you can get to Asgard by the Rainbow Bridge. And there's what used to be 9 realms and are now actually 10 realms because there's the 10th realm because of complicated things. And you can also go to the blue area of the moon, which is an area of the moon that has oxygen in it, like has an atmosphere, and there's an entity who lives there who observes and witnesses everything, not only on our world, but on all possible worlds, but is nominally forbidden to interfere with it at all. So he just gets to narrate these stories, and he's the watcher. And there's the Savage Land, which if you go down to Antarctica and like can go inside the Earth, there's like the Earth isn't hollow, but there's a hollow little bit of Antarctica, which inside it is kind of this tropical environment where dinosaurs of every kind still live. And there are the other dimensions that Doctor Strange goes to, like very, very early on, before Steve Ditko realized what he was doing was an absolutely beautiful metaphor for drugs. And just so many other worlds and possible worlds and different worlds and alternate universes. And we're starting to see like Multiverse of Madness and all the multiverse stuff going on with the most recent Spider-Man movie, but this has been a pretty big thing of the Marvel comic story since very, very early on. In the Marvel comic story, the world on which the stories happen is Earth 616. And I love that because it's not Earth 1. It's not the most important one. It's not the one from which everything else is derived. It's just one of a lot of different possibilities. And yeah, the idea that the world does not have to be the way it is a useful thing to keep in mind in all kinds of contexts. More questions, please. I can try to answer questions about the MCU too, or OMG, I love all of this. That's really nice. Here's a question that was direct messaged from Lara. I've always been sort of fascinated with the negative zone, but in all the media I've seen of it, I've only seen bits and pieces, and I was wondering how much more there is to it than just a barren hellscape outside of a portal. That's a super good question. So the thing that we most associate with the negative zone is there's a particular image that in all the Marvels, like there's a chapter that's where to start or how to enjoy being confused. Because where do you start with this? You start anywhere. You start anywhere you like. No, but you got to start somewhere. Okay, I am going to pick one particular story and one particular page as a vantage point. And what that page is a page from Fantastic Four 51, where Mr. Fantastic, the Fantastic Four, is going into this kind of otherworldly thing. Call it the negative zone. I think he calls it subspace in there. The phrase the negative zone had actually been used a little bit earlier in Fantastic Four to describe like the dome that covered the Inhuman city of Attilan. But later on, that weird kind of like everything is floating and everything looks bizarre space became like, that's the negative zone. That is the thing we're calling the negative zone. And in that first page in Fantastic Four 51, Jack Kirby represents it not with a drawing, but with a collage. And it's this gorgeous, fantastic, otherworldly kind of looking collage. Like this is beyond anything we can draw. We're just going to chop up pieces of photographs and represent it that way. And it's when you need to send somebody on into some other space, yeah, you go to the negative zone. Negative zone, like physics work differently there. We can find our unobtainium there. By FF Annual 6, I think gets up, Annihilus is this kind of bug-like, radiator-like creature who runs it with his, quote, cosmic control rod. And so it keeps being that kind of space. It later gets used as a prison space during Civil War. It was just sitting around, we can use a prison. There's a Fantastic Four run by Jonathan Hickman from 12 years or so ago, where there is an attack from the Negative Zone, and the Human Torch from the Fantastic Four essentially sacrifices himself to like go into the Negative Zone, seal the portal behind him, and it's like, now there's 3 members of the Fantastic Four. What are we gonna do? We can't be the Fantastic Four anymore. So Fantastic Four changes its name to FF, for Future Foundation. That goes on for a year, and then they discover that you know, Johnny is still alive in there because death inside the Negative Zone means you can come back from it in a way that you can't come back. And coming back from the dead when you were dead, that's become a really big, really interesting theme just in the last 10, 15 years of the Marvel story. I'm going on a tangent here, but it's a fun tangent, so I hope you'll forgive me. And Nick, I will get to your question in a minute. The soul can't go to wherever it goes. I don't know. There's a real interesting. So Lara asks, do you think that it's because the soul can't go to wherever it goes in Marvel from the Negative Zone? The theological implications, as Linus Van Pelt once said, are staggering. There's a thing that came out just yesterday, actually, from yesterday's comic that points to that. But let me talk for just a minute about death in comics. Death in comics, it used to be like characters don't die. They don't go away for good. Occasionally you would see a character die, and it would be a big moment, and it would have huge impact. Spider-Man's girlfriend Gwen Stacy dies. Gigantic shock. Everybody remembers it. Phoenix from the X-Men kills herself to avoid destroying the universe or whatever. But massive, massive shockwaves. And then characters started coming back. Superman, he's dead. We'll never see him again. Oh no, he's back. Batman, he's had his spine broken. No, he's fine. He got better. And characters would die, and characters would come back, because in a gigantic narrative like this, if a character is important enough that their death is going to have dramatic impact, they're also important enough that somebody is going to want to use them later on. It's a franchise. Aunt May, oh no, she's dead. No, she's fine. No, she's dead. No, that was an actress impersonator. Real Aunt May is fine. And they keep coming back. And the X-Men comics, it really kept happening. They would come back and come back and come back. And death started to lose its impact as a dramatic device. And it's kind of the ultimate dramatic device, so that's a big old problem. And where the X-Men comics for the last 3 years have gone is leaning into that hard. Because part of the premise is mutants have discovered how to solve death. When a mutant dies, they can immediately be reincarnated. We make a new body, we duplicate their memories, and pull their soul back. Pull their soul back. What's up with that? Well, that's interesting. And there's a reference in, I think, X-Men Red, fantastic new series this week, to part of what the mutants are doing with reincarnating them as the thing that draws the soul back to its new body. That's some theology right there. I don't know if that's something that people are going to be relying on in the future, but they're addressing it. And the really interesting thing about these X-Men comics from the last couple of years, and there's a whole line of them, there's like 10, 12 X-Men related comics a month. Immortal X-Men is about their governing body for this island nation that they've started. Way of X is about them working out the philosophy of their culture. And how do we address philosophical issues if we can be brought back to life when we die? How does that make things different? X-Corp is about how does the finances of this nation work? So they're really looking into okay, what's it actually mean to build a new culture, to build a new nation? And I love that. I've gotten so far afield of Lara's question here that I like answering it. Nick has a question, which is, in the Marvel story, did you see a tension between magical knowledge and scientific knowledge? Yeah, kind of. And the thing about Magic is there really are no rules. So you have to make a way for a tennis game to be exciting if there's no net and no court. Some people can do that. But very often in stories about Magic, the way that they are made to be interesting is by making them really about something else. Like there's a Doctor Strange serial that Steve Ditko drew back in the 60s, and it ran for like 15 issues. Like, this was the idea of having a continued story was a pretty new thing. It'd been done comics a couple times before, but people were writing in like, are you doing like a movie serial thing where there's like a new episode every issue, but it continues? That's new. But so it's fantastic serial, but the part that people remember best of it is actually this like hand-to-hand combat scene with Dormammu and Doctor Strange fighting with these pincers, and it becomes about that instead of like, okay, I'm casting a spell and that's going to solve the problem. Magic, the Ilyana Rasputin miniseries from back in the 80s, is this very, very fondly remembered story, and it's all Magic users, and it's all people learning to use Magic. And it's not like, let's cast a spell that can do a thing, but it's about it. It's a story that's actually about child abuse. And it is a story where the sorcerer's apprentice is the abused child. And that's what it's really about. And about the way that that is passed on from this malign character to this kid who has her childhood literally truncated. Like, she loses 7 years of her life because of this. And like, that's the story. The like, what spells did you learn to cast, Ilyana? Like, that's not the point of the story. The point is, what does this allow us to do as a metaphor? And that's what's special about that. I mean, in the same way, like the scientific knowledge, there's not a lot in the Marvel story of, flash facts like you would see in the DC comics of the 60s that John Broome and Gardner Fox were writing. The Flash or the Atom or whatever would save something with like actual knowledge of science. Like, here is a scientific principle that we know, and we're going to solve the problem with it. The science in Marvel's comics, it's more often pseudoscience. It is, we're just gonna make up a portal to the negative zone. Yeah, that works now. And sure, okay, that's science. That'll work. Super scientific genius will make up a super scientific thing. It's science in theory rather than in practice. I'm having a lot of fun answering these. Y'all can mic up. You can send me a chat. If I had more songs, I'd sing more songs. Nick, you have your thumb up. Let me see if I can unmute you. I can ask you to unmute. I can't unmute you myself. Jeff, can you allow people to unmute?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Nick just wanted to say thank you. Okay.
Oh.
Any last questions from you, Jeff?
Let me see. Do you have oh, actually we have a question in the chat here. Favorite character or part of this series from M. Gauthier?
Ooh. And also a question from Sheila about Wanda's power source. Okay. So M. Gauthier, favorite character. So I get asked if I have a favorite character a lot. My answer changes pretty much daily. In some senses, I love Squirrel Girl. I love Squirrel Girl. And Squirrel Girl is ridiculous. Squirrel Girl originally appeared as a joke character, like a one-off character around 1990, 1991. She was the last significant Marvel character to be co-created by Steve Ditko with a writer named Will Murray. And for years after that, like whenever she appeared, it was like, can you believe we published the Squirrel Girl comic? And then back in 2015, Ryan North, writer, and Erica Henderson, artist, came up with a take on Squirrel Girl that I love, and that other people love too, because their version of it ran for like 5 years. And their take on it was that she's, powers of a squirrel, powers of a girl, but what she's really good at is creative nonviolent conflict resolution. And that is what that comic is about. She, the mole man attacks and is talking about how the surface world has, denied him all the time. And it's like, I hear you. I'm not going to argue with your lived experience, and I can let me see if I can rephrase what you're saying here. Okay. And of course, he's flabbergasted that anybody's actually listening to his grievances. And well, then he falls in love with her and does the whole milady thing for a while, and that's problematic for her too. But that is an absolutely fantastically funny premise for this comic that ran for 5 years and does not take any of this comic book apparatus stuff seriously at all, and also takes it absolutely letter for letter seriously. I love it, and I love that character. I've also been known to say that like my favorite hero is Dr. Doom, who is vicious and murderous and illiistic and ego. You get the size of the planet ego, and also like saved everything more than once. And my favorite villain is Emma Frost from the X-Men, who is nominally a hero, but just has this vicious streak that she will never, ever be able to rid herself of. So those are some of my favorites. And Sheila wants to know about Wanda's power source. Now, we're talking Wanda in the MCU, or we're talking Wanda in the comics? Because the comics, Wanda has been revised a couple of times. Okay, so comics, Sheila says. So, as originally introduced, she was a mutant. That's her source. She can change probabilities through mutant stuff. And then we also had her learning magic, which is not a mutant thing. So she's got that in her background too, arcane knowledge. There's the idea, is there such a thing as chaos magic? Maybe there's no such thing as chaos magic. Oh wait, as of 6 months ago, there is such a thing as chaos magic. And that's a thing that Wanda does. The interesting thing about Wanda in the comics is she hangs around for a while. She becomes more and more unstable. She has like these kids who you saw on the TV show who are kind of not real. Like they're kind of real and they're also kind of not real. Like she kind of magicked them into existence. And she realizes that they're not real and she kind of loses it for a while. And then she has all of her memory of ever having had these kids erased from her. Except it doesn't get erased from everybody else. And eventually somebody reminds her of it. And she loses it. She goes nuts. She does a bunch of horribly destructive things that she then has to live with the consequences of for decades worth of comics. Almost 20 years, and there becomes this thread of her as the character who has done awful, awful things and is now trying to make it better, trying to put the genie back in the bottle, and the genie doesn't want to go back in the bottle. Not to be confused with Ms. Marvel, for those of you watching that. But she keeps trying to make things better and keeps making things worse in making things better, and like you can't unring a bell. And finally, just last year, her story is brought to this point where she's like, she can't undo the thing that she did, but she can do something that makes amends for it. And that's special. That's like, she actually finds her moment of redemption. And what is her power source? It is, it's kind of the magical thing, and it's kind of the mutant thing. And this story, the story is X-Men: The Trial of Magneto, written by Leah Williams, who's very interesting young comics writer, doing really interesting stuff. But the story manages to be like Her power source is maybe not even the important thing so much as, is she going to be able to make up for what she's done? So that is a half answer to your question. I apologize for not answering it better, Sheila. If you have clarifications, feel free to mic up. Nick says, how has Marvel's relationship to religious or spiritual stuff changed over time? Mephisto, Ghost Rider, and other demons? That's a fantastic question. So back in the 1970s, in the early issues of Ghost Rider, there is a character who shows up a couple times who is clearly supposed to be Jesus. But he's just like, I'm a friend. He's a friend. Look, I'm your friend. He's never identified as Jesus. And he actually showed up a couple of years ago in an absolutely hysterical miniseries called You Are Deadpool, which is a Deadpool series that is also a choose-your-own-adventure story and also a one-person role-playing game. Worth seeking out. Anyway, the friend turns up there, but was son of Satan was a character. And then at some point in the 70s or 80s, there was an edict, and the edict was not from the Comics Code. It was an internal Marvel edict. You couldn't say hell. You couldn't say Satan. This made things difficult if you were son of Satan. And in fact, a couple of years later, Marvel, in their humor magazine, What The, published a thing where Damon Hellstrom is trying to find a new identity, and initially he's son of Santa, and then decides, I'm a Marvel character, I might as well be son of Stan. So there was this kind of prudishness almost around it, like trying to get it right. So there are a number of kind of demi-satanic characters, and there is Mephisto, and there's some sort of Lucifer type. There's, oh god, who's the one from Kazar, the one that Magic gets a locket from? There's a bunch of sort of Satan stand-in characters who appeared during this time, and of course, writers later working from this is like, oh yeah, these are all sort of evil entities, all of whom have claimed to be Satan at one time or another, but nobody's willing to actually sit on the throne of hell because that would set off a civil war. And so there's this fantastic sequence in Journey into Mystery when Kieran Gillen was writing it about 10 years ago that goes into that there is this ongoing eternal power struggle in hell, and that Satan has more or less abandoned them, and everybody wants to be the new Satan, and nobody can get away with it. And you can get away with a lot more now, too. There is the term the one above all, which is like, oh, he's kind of, sort of the Judeo-Christian God, kind of. But also, in the Marvel cosmology, Thor is real, Hercules is real. Every mythological body of work that humans have ever written down is in the Marvel universe. Like, no, they're actual entities. They're in the sky, or they're in Asgard, or they're whatever. These are all just interesting things that happened at some point that somebody wrote down. And, a number of them claim to have created the universe, and it's just a bunch of like old gods arguing over which one of them was responsible for creating the universe in the first place. So there's that sort of all-encompassing theological lowercase c Catholicism there. But you've got the one above all, who's more or less God, although there was a sequence in Fantastic Four where the Fantastic Four went to heaven and met God, and God was Jack Kirby. But The Immortal Hulk, which is a fantastic series that just ended recently, written by Al Ewing. In Immortal Hulk, there is the one above all, who we have a little bit of contact with, and there's also the one below all. And the end of Immortal Hulk, spoilers, they're the same. They are the same entity. So that's a significant change that has happened over time. more long-winded answers. Anybody else got a thing? Thank you. I really like that question. I really like all these questions. Y'all are real good question askers. Hi, Jeff. Your mic is off again. Now it's on.
Okay. Yeah, just if anybody has a last question.
If not, well, thank you all so much for having me. It has been a joy to talk to you all. Thank you for requesting the book. I love it when people request my book at their library. And I've been doing weekly Twitter threads at Twitter/Douglas Wolk about romance comics of the early 70s. In fact, romance comics that came out exactly 50 years ago to the day. So that's been going on, and got a Patreon at Douglas Wolk, and DouglasWolk.com has all kinds of information too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas, for a great presentation.
Thanks so much. Oh, one last question from Brittany. Are you planning to do this for the DC universe? I have my eyes to think about. Thank you, though. Take care, all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.